Welcome to Abiding Hysteria, the monthly podcast where women and gender-diverse people tell their health stories, both as patients and providers, to help shed some light on the role that gendered bias plays in medicine. I'm your host, Rachel Woodard. To hear my health story, check out our episode 0. Our guest this month is Emily Mendenhall, who is an anthropologist, Guggenheim Fellow, and professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She has authored 6 books, including Syndemic Suffering, Global Mental Health, Rethinking Diabetes, Unmasked, Savoring Care, and Invisible Illness, which we'll talk about in this episode. She serves as editor-in-chief of a new publication, Science Politics, and has written for Scientific American, Vox, and Psychology Today. In this conversation, we discuss her newest book, Medical Anthropology, Invisible Illnesses, and more. For early access to episodes with bonus content such as uncut and video versions, become a patron for only $5 a month at patreon.com/abidinghysteria. If you can't become a patron but still want to help these stories get told, remember to share the show, rate and review us on your platform of choice, or leave a comment. Please remember this podcast is for informational purposes and not a substitute for individual medical advice. My discussion question this month is, if you have an invisible illness, what is the best way that someone who cares for you can show up for you? Let's discuss this and more on our Discord, or you can find me on social media at Abiding Hysteria. Links to those are in the show notes. And now, please help me in welcoming Emily to the show. Welcome, Emily Mendenhall. I'm so happy to have you here. For our listeners, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to the show?
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for the invitation. It's just such a treat to sit with you and have some time to talk about this. My name is Emily Mendenhall. I am a professor at Georgetown University. I'm a medical anthropologist, and I wrote a book recently. I had a Guggenheim Fellowship, which was just like this incredible moment to think and dive into a new topic that I had thought about a bit. But throughout the fellowship, I was able to, well, my kids actually, if you ask them what I was doing, they're like, oh, she's just a yoga and walks the dogs. But I actually interviewed over 150 people and really dug into the complex lives of living with complex chronic illness. And I've studied chronic illness for 2 decades, and specifically with women around the world. But thinking about post-viral conditions particularly was really interesting. And I started interviewing people with long COVID who have a lot of similarities in embodied experiences as people with ME/CFS. And I just realized very quickly that it was not a new story and that the book had to be much longer. I'm an anthropologist, so I like to think in like longer terms and really think about how ideas and frames and medical diagnoses even change through time and where they come from. So that was, it just became a central part of the book.
Yeah, and having gone through this and going through this myself, I'm so thankful that you wrote this book, because there are so many of us going through all of these stories right now and going, I'm looking in a mirror right now. So whatever comes in this interview, I just want to say thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. It was such a labor of love. And it just felt like really important right now, especially with misogyny rearing its head in a way we haven't seen for a really long time. It feels like an important piece to get out there.
Oh, for sure. And that's why this podcast exists too. It's the same idea of like just trying to kind of resist in whatever way I can. So what was the initial catalyst that inspired you to write this particular story?
Well, it actually goes back. I mean, I've been studying complex living with chronic illness and how I studied diabetes for like 2 decades. And the first time I really dug into kind of the links between trauma and diabetes was in 2006 when I was working at Cook County Hospital. And I spent hours and hours and hours listening, doing work, spending time, sometimes translating and also interviewing mostly Mexican immigrant women living with diabetes, documented and undocumented. And it just became so clear that diabetes was, one aspect of their life. When you're in the medical setting, everyone wants to talk about your diagnosis and really get to the gritty of that. But like how people lived and experienced illness was so much broader. And when I studied anthropology, this became really centered in how I work. And then during COVID, I was wrapping up this big study in South Africa with my team, and I couldn't go there, looking at how social and health conditions travel together. And so actually, I live in Georgetown, or I teach at Georgetown, and I'm in DC, where it is like the epicenter of global health security, is where the field emerged. And, everyone was really engaged and deeply committed to responding in the communities I worked in. I work in a School of International Affairs and the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. So it was a very, we were just steeped in it, in the center of it. And my friend, Rebecca Katz, it was very central to it, who's a professor and works at the State Department. We decided to go out west to quarantine with my sister and her kids, because my kids were 4 and 6 at the time, and we were pretty maxed out and had no childcare. And so we packed up, made the kids pee on the side of the road, like we did in those days.
Yeah.
And drove out to Iowa. And we arrived in the middle of an outbreak. And after having police outside of a grocery store in Maryland, which after coming back from hiking, we couldn't even go in without a mask, which we had masks, but it was so policed. And out west, no one was masking. And as we went farther west, I saw this huge transition. So anyways, I ended up rolling up my sleeves and wondering, what's at the heart of this? Why is it so different? And my brother-in-law was leading the COVID response. So anyways, I ended up interviewing everyone I knew. And I wrote a book called Unmasked, COVID Community in the Case of Okoboji. And that really made me think deeply about COVID. But we were all in this moment and COVID politics, and we're all also at this moment where, long COVID, as early as May, already had become this very central talking point. And part of it was because of the patient activists. But soon after, I had a student who got really, really sick. And I was like, well, and I was thinking about long COVID, but not deeply embedded in it. And I was like, well, and he wanted to drop out of school, and I kind of supported him. And then he didn't want to do an honors thesis because he didn't have the energy, and he was very ill. And I was like, why don't you just start? Let's not make a decision, but why don't you just start doing an intensive journaling project on all of your feelings and your experiences, going to the doctor, your symptoms. And he just ended up doing this beautiful project, doing this incredible kind of reflexive project. And then he actually ended up interviewing 60 other people, policymakers, clinicians, patients later, which ended up being this great project. But through him and working really, really closely with him, I saw the complexities that especially fatigue and dysautonomia and memory inconsistency really played out, and how different. We actually co-wrote a piece in Scientific American about brain fog, because brain fog is such a bad word. It's such a bad term. It's supposed to include any sort of cognitive disorientation that may be linked to a virus, but it's from anything from word recall to psychosis or hallucination,
Yeah, it's just kind of a catch-all, when you use the word fish for everything in the ocean, and you're that's not a classification.
Exactly. And so that just so many issues from his experience, and then I was diving deep into it because we all got obsessed. He and I were thinking and talking about it all the time. And then about a year later, I got pretty sick, and it made me think about it in a new way, because I got COVID for the first time, and I have an anxiety disorder, and my anxiety just went through the roof, and I felt like I couldn't calm down, and my fatigue was pretty intense for 4 to 6 months. I couldn't exercise. I was just too tired. But it wasn't intense like the people I had spoken to or Ken. And so I wasn't really thinking about myself, and I don't really self-identify as someone who had long COVID, even though I got sick in November. It took me 2 months to recover. That's a reality for me. So I think a lot, and I think some of my own experience really framed my theory of thresholds, which is at the end of the first part of the book, which is how I think about, it's building on multiple different theories from other fields, but really thinking about what is the virus. It's not, or what is the kind of breaking point, the infection or whatever it is. It's actually a tipping point, really, or a threshold.
I really enjoyed you talking about it as, especially with COVID, as the catalyst or the spark that lights the fire of other things that we have as underlying conditions or just genetic predispositions towards something, where it's a powder keg that's waiting to be lit, and COVID just happened to light the fire this time.
Yeah. Thinking about it using weathering theory or allostatic load or exosomes, which are such thoughtful biological theories, but maybe don't make as much sense in the social context. So I try to flip it around and talk about it more through the story of Tam, this incredible person who I interviewed who had endometriosis and, several things that happened, but she was just so brilliant and to talk, in talking about her illness and so reflexive that I was able to really get to reveal in her story not only the kind of unverifiability of her conditions, which is part of the invisible part, but how she felt so invisible, through the kind of loss of her social life or being in a clinic where no one took her seriously at all or never even saw her. And, that played out in so many of those stories. And so invisible isn't only to the labor force. It's not only to physically present in society, but it's to your friends and your family, and also to clinicians. And it's just that kind of stress is so interesting. Although also like digital lives have transformed people living with complex chronic conditions that are, related to fatigue and other conditions, which I feel like has been so radical for people's experiences.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just in my own experience being on Threads in particular, for some reason, I found tons of disability advocates and protests and stuff like that happening on there. And Instagram too, found a lot of disabled creators who are finding a platform with each other on there. And it's so cool to see how we're finding community in different ways as much as we can, because that's how we survive.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's sometimes for some people, it's the first time they start to even realize what's happening. They start having conversations and they're like, no one knows what's going on with me, but my symptoms are very much the same. Like they actually resemble that. Maybe I should go. And, I talk about this a lot, but like you could have a completely different diagnosis than someone because you have a primary diagnosis, but actually have the same collection of conditions as someone and have a very similar experience to someone who has this diagnosed with, primary diagnosis is totally different, and then have the same primary diagnosis as someone and have like almost no similarity in your condition.
Right? Yeah. One thing that I found really interesting in your book is the connection between hysteria and long COVID. Could you talk a little bit about that and sort of your timeline from hysteria to long COVID? Because I thought that was really cool how you painted the picture between something that seems so ancient and like old fashioned, but is still present in our medical stuff today.
Yeah, as a social phenomenon, the hysteria trope of women, has gone on for centuries and centuries and centuries, and really constructing women as being of the womb and illness as being linked to our reproduction, which still in so many times, like don't be hysterical, or, women are dismissed on so many levels. But it's just so interesting to see through history how these constructs have changed and been renamed and remade, but how conditions specifically are extracted from this narrative once there is a biological verifiable condition or like marker. So thinking about multiple sclerosis is the best example, MS, when they found plaques in the brain, a condition that had long been tied to called hysteria was extracted and given a different category and become more verified or more visible really in the medical community and more valid for care for, even though you can't really, even though there's not like a prescription, just having the diagnosis itself was transformative for those patients, gave them a power and a group for advocacy, which is really interesting. And things that the medical community still doesn't know, or doesn't understand or can't measure, is still perceived to be largely psychological, which is incredibly harmful for patients.
Yeah. And something that I've explored a little bit on this show that I really want to dive into with a lot of my guests is, do you think that there, in our current medical thinking, there's room for I don't knows?
Yeah, that is such a good question. Oh my gosh. Yes, that's a good question. And I think that's what needs to be actually at the center. I don't know, but I interviewed for the book Jamie Seltzer, who's the scientific director of ME Action. And she talked about a lot of things. One of the things she talked about was how critical their advocacy program for Teach ME, Treat ME is, which is going into medical schools and training people, doctors, doing even if it's a couple day workshop, training them to identify and understand what myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome is. And, I talk about that in the book pretty extensively. But, one of the problems I talk about in the book, which I know this is why you brought it up, is that when clinicians don't know what to do, and because of the culture of medicine that, instigates or instills this like extraordinary need to be the authoritative figure in a clinical space, clinicians are not usually going to say that I don't know, or they'll be like, oh, you need to see the specialist. They'll punt you down to someone else. Or some of them will absolutely shut you down and say that's not what you think it is. And that happened to nearly everyone I interviewed. But a lot of good clinicians are not actually bad doctors, which they're perceived to be, but in part, they just don't know what the heck they're doing. They have no idea, and they don't want to screw up. So they punt. And I think that's really, really common. But because the training is so superficial, even if it's an afternoon when they talk about complex conditions, it's really difficult to change a culture based on this kind of medical hegemony and really authority making of doctors, conceiving doctors as God and all-knowing. I worked with some other patients and patient scholars, and we wrote this piece and I write about this at the end, but about patients as knowledge partners and being able to conceive and sit with patients, especially like Tam I mentioned earlier, who is probably the only person on this earth who understands this weird condition that she has better than anyone else because she's lived it, but she's also done extensive research. And that's the thing with a lot of patients is they've done so much scientific research to try to understand what the heck is wrong with them. So just simply being like, I don't know, and then saying, I'm going to refer you to my colleague is probably more powerful and helpful for patients.
What did you find most compelling in researching this book in particular?
I think I was just really moved by the brilliance of the patients and how, I've always been interested in the fact that illness is so embedded in their social lives and their people's relationships, and how suffering isn't always just about the illness or the disease, right? The bottle, like the whatever's going on in the body, but it's really about the support you have. Even someone to like bring you food or help you shower or bring you to the clinic. And some of those stories are so powerful. And a lot of the stories I share in the book, and actually I ended up taking out a ton of stories because I just had so much. And I put a lot of them on my blog. Definitely not all of them. I've done over 150 interviews, so they're not all on the blog.
Yeah.
But I have a Substack blog that just shares the stories and it's all free. There's no cost. But
we'll definitely put that in the show notes then, for sure.
Yeah, I think it can really help. And as people were talking about different stories and different interviews I did that I knew wouldn't go in the book, but were really compelling, I would just put them on the blog too. Especially talking about allergy, because long COVID, if we think about it in the thresholds metaphor, long COVID can be so many different things. There's people who've had, we have athletes who've had really intense heart conditions. We've had people who have this weird allergies emerge. Mm-hmm. We've, of course, had the condition that kind of mirrors ME/CFS, pretty similar when people have post-exertional malaise exacerbation, where even taking a shower can be exhausting. And especially for these patients, I think it's really, really important to reimagine care. And something that I talk a little bit about at the end of the book with my interview with Alba Zola is reimagining what care can look like and should look like, which is, an elongated clinical case where you have people who can care for all your symptoms come and have a chat. And we know there's precedence for this. If we think about military medicine or the VA, they do this, right? There's actually medical centers that we can draw from. It's just how do we finance it? And our financing models for healthcare, as you know, is just so problematic.
Yeah.
We can't get past it.
Given your extensive research and the stories that you've heard in all of these interviews, what gives you the most hope for those with invisible illnesses?
I think that and I say this at the beginning, I think we are in a watershed moment for complex chronic illness because I think part of it is just awareness of the fact that there is no residency, for example, for clinicians to give all of their attention and research and time and take seriously complex chronic illnesses. There's no space in medicine to do this. Yeah. And I think COVID has actually created more space than we had before. And COVID has cultivated this opportunity to really take seriously patient communities who for a long time have just been, for centuries, have been dismissed. And, especially with the construction of chronic fatigue syndrome, which is so harmful just the language. I mean, as it emerged in the 1980s, patients were already like, what are you doing? This is very harmful. And, as patients had advocated to change the terminology and the framing and the criterion, having long COVID has really galvanized that community in a way, because they become so enmeshed in other complex chronic illness communities, I think. And that the activism through digital networks has been really empowering for several ways. Several reasons. There's so much research into how to, support this community innovatively for detection, but also care. So I think without COVID, not a lot would have changed. But with this surge of patients and clinicians getting sick, clinicians getting sick and really taking this seriously for the first time, because they're like, I can't get better. And that kind of global influence and recognition, I think gives me hope, because I think people don't think about it in the same way that they used to. And that really matters.
Yeah. And it's funny to think of it as such a catalyst for so many different things. What role do you think culture plays in categorizing and diagnosing these invisible and chronic illnesses? Because you dive into it so much in the book, but I really want to see if you can sum it up in a way that we can just give a small glimpse without going the whole book.
Yeah. I'm an anthropologist, so I study culture, and, in medicine is itself a culture, right? How we think about illness, how the body is considered a machine, and how diagnoses and treatments are really supposed to just fix that machine. And that's really tricky, especially because medicine doesn't deal with complexity. So I spent a lot of time talking about where medical biases of women come from. But I also spent a lot of time talking about the politics of the construction of chronic fatigue syndrome, in part to show how harmful it has been for women, particularly, and how dismissive even the origin story has been very harmful. And, I spent a lot of time. It's just so interesting. I think people are so sensitive about the history and politics of ME/CFS. Like, I actually just got attacked and accused on, I had a piece in the Sick Times. It was just a piece of the book, and someone I think didn't read the book carefully and is just very, very sensitive, and attacked me and said, "Oh, you're advocating for GET, CBT, the PACE trials, basically, and you're advocating that you should just get care from functional neurological disorder patients." I'm like, what are you saying?
Oh, that section on PACE trials. Oh, God.
I know. It's so hard. And you know what? I actually submitted a version of that to be published in an article, and I eventually withdrew it because I just wanted it to be in the book. But there is this neuropsychiatrist in England who read it and sent a 17-page rebuttal.
Yeah, that was
my
wild.
Piece on the PACE trials, and I had to manage him, and I actually did change some things based on his critiques, because I wanted to have that perspective somewhat, even though it's a bit muted, because I don't agree with that perspective, because both perspectives seem quite extreme, and it's so difficult to find any sort of common ground. I think the reporting on, especially Hillary Johnson, especially Dave Tuller, that reporting of really lifting the lid on the medical hegemony that has really harmed people by ignoring patients, even though patients were organized and responding, is a really troubling thing. And I don't think actually people know enough about the PACE trials. So I wanted to kind of put that, the patient community does, but I wanted to really center that in that chapter, because I think the construction of ME/CFS, which has gone through, many different renditions and into what it is today, cannot be divorced from how because diagnosis and treatment are often embedded and mutually in conversation. So telling that story was really important. And just thinking about how conditions, specifically in neuropsych, are constructed by clinicians who come into working groups and define them and give them categories. And when women don't have a seat at the table, or people of color, or trans people, or people with disabilities, also people who are, being diagnosed and identified, but are not, when they don't have a seat at the table, these kinds of constructs can be incredibly harmful, because the biases that are like the sexism, framed in chronic fatigue syndrome was just so clear. But when these biases are embedded in naming and framing, it also is perpetuated in care. And I think looking at neurasthenia, this framing of an American kind of illness, which was so interesting to read about.
That was wild. I was like, I just can't even think about the fact that there was a diagnosis that was basically like Americans. Just, it's so crazy. Like, how do we have a uniquely American brand of stress?
And we do. I mean, if you take a step back, I mean, I don't know if you lived outside of the country, but I've lived out of the country a few different periods of my life. Whenever I come back to the U.S., it's like, oh my God, this place is so stressful. Yeah. Because you forget that consistent pressure and judgment and the pace in which we're expected to live in. And I think that it's like, the American type of stress, what does that look like and how does it become embodied? And I think it is perpetuating so much illness and so much dysregulation that is not easily detected or understood because it's multi-system.
Oh, for sure. I originally from Michigan and moved to the rural Southeast in North Carolina. So seeing just the difference between being in like a moderately sized city in the North versus the rural South, it's a huge culture shift in terms of like how professionalism is viewed, how you have a conversation and such. So I think even not having lived outside of the country, but living in such distantly related parts of the country really shifts your perspective on what pressures and what judgments are on you at the time. But also perhaps the perspective on your diagnoses and that sort of thing, and whether you're going to be believed or not. Absolutely. Because especially reproductive health things are really difficult in this area. And especially for young women who are trying to get taken seriously. So it's interesting to see what the difference is between those regions.
Yeah, I think the endometriosis story is really important when we think about visibility and reproduction and inability, lack of reproduction or lack, whatever is abnormal, which is, all of us are living our truth, but endometriosis is so hard because it takes from 6 to 9 years to get a diagnosis. And it's like so hard to diagnose without actually like opening you up and going in and finding the tissue. Yeah. I think the endo stories are so hard because there is visibility. There's endobelly, right? You have a visible recognition, something that's visible, but people don't understand it. So, really being able to go to see how pain thresholds are through the roof, for people experiencing endometriosis, and how endometriosis is a hidden backdoor or, hidden underlying condition that is then layered with other conditions that are just really, really complicate things. And because we've done so little research on endometriosis and know so little about how people live it or how to care for people to overcome and live well with it or from it, it's really hard. It's really hard in medicine to do that kind of clinical care.
I have so many questions. I want to make sure I get to the really good ones. Oh, actually, my husband had a question. So the book is separated into two parts, history and politics. Both of the social scientists are essentially about power and perspective. Power and who has it and who doesn't has a great influence on our perspective and individuals and in culture. So would you say then that the fundamental problem in healthcare is rooted in the inequality of power?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And
I mean, I think, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and the follow-up is, how do we change that?
I mean, I think it's all about money. And I think it's almost impossible to change anything until we reverse Citizens United. Because
thank you, God.
Because I think the power in politics and the money in politics and business in politics is just never gonna. It's just putting profit over people again and again and again and again. And until we actually can reimagine, like I think single payer would be incredible, but I don't think it'll ever work in the US. But there's a lot of models. Like we could have nonprofit insurance organizations. Like there are lots of precedents. There's a lot of models that we could innovate and think about in the US that would take profit out of healthcare. I mean, before the 1980s, around the world, most people thought about health as a social good, not as a commodity. But especially with structural adjustment programs and the introduction of U.S. values and ideas, they privatized health systems and, bought and sold and benefited for the state off people's sickness. And this is really, really tough. It's really hard, especially for people who are poor, to afford healthcare. And so they don't go. And so people go to this is stuff I've worked on for years is, people only go get care when they're really, really sick. So what does that do? It means that, there's power within like clinical medicine, how people are trained, but there's also power in how health systems are framed and how things are financed. So, so I did organize the book into two parts, the history and politics part. And it was part because I was trying to tell two different stories that were completely enmeshed, but separate. And I needed to tell that historical story. And it's actually interesting, like even the chronic Lyme chapter, I had like way later, in an earlier version. And then I just felt like it wasn't off and I wasn't nailed. I just like hadn't figured something out. And my editor was waiting for it and I needed a big thing. So I had my senior seminar students read it. And they were amazing. They were all seniors in my, I was teaching a mind madness meditation class and where we learned about mental health and not only psychosis, but mental well-being around the world. And then I taught them how to I introduced them to all sorts of types of meditation. Anyway, it was like this wonderful class. So we'd been thinking about these issues. And they just dissected it and they helped me reorganize the entire book. And they were just incredible. So that was a really fun thing. But partly, one of my students was like, you have to move Lyme up. It has to go up. And the thresholds piece was a part I didn't know where to put, but it really landed. It actually really transitioned well. There's actually on my blog, I have a few pieces that were parts of chapters early on that are more about the biological piece. And the biological elements, because I interviewed some researchers and clinicians who were writing about the biological underpinnings of infection-associated conditions, especially like Mike Van Elseker, who I just love his work. He's at Tufts in DC in Boston. He has an organization called Polybio, where they do a lot of research on infection-associated conditions. He's done a lot of debunking essays and research about, well, actually, this is real. Like, let's think about how the body dysregulates and what it means. And that was really great to read about. And also, so I told a little bit of that, but it didn't end up being it. A lot of the stuff I had kind of drafted didn't go in the book. So it's on the blog. But then the patient activism piece, especially the health activism piece. So I tell a story of starting with AIDS activism because again and again it kept coming up in my interviews with patient activists who were disability activists or had long COVID or had ME/CFS, who kept talking about the kind of historical legacy of AIDS activism. And as someone who's worked in global health and who teaches health politics at a School of International Affairs, and I teach the history of AIDS activism, I was just so interested. It made me think about a lot of stuff I'd been teaching for a long time. So putting those conversations in dialogue and thinking about patients living with myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, ME/CFS for decades, they get sick and they can't literally walk in the streets and protest. But, AIDS patients during the same time when it started gaining recognition could protest until they couldn't. So the visibility component was radically different. And I think I even interviewed Tony Fauci. I wrote about our interview in Scientific American. And he was like, you know what? I was working on autoimmune diseases and really interested in post-viral infections. But then AIDS ate up all my time in my life, and
Right.
It did because of the activist group, the activism. And those AIDS activists rewrote the rules of patient activism, transformed the entire landscape. And one physician researcher actually said the women of the body politic patient advocacy group from early days of the long COVID pandemic are the new Larry Kramer. They're the new AIDS activists who transformed how we think about activism, patient activism digitally. And so there was precedence for this. but, the activism they were able to do globally. And I even interviewed some people with long COVID in Kenya, and their kind of activist connections came back to this original group. So the visibility they were able to bring to long COVID was unprecedented, absolutely incredible. So, the first part is talking about the kind of construction of these oppressive frames. And the second part is a bit about the liberation, and about disability justice and what that looks like, especially through the lens of long COVID.
What I'm hearing is that in order to get our health concerns heard, we need drag queens on our side.
Sure.
Oh, that's amazing. So one thing that I really appreciated about this book was the use of the concept of the body mind. Could you tell the audience a little bit about that concept and why it was so important to use for this book in particular?
Well, some of my friends and colleagues who are disability scholars really schooled me. Anthropology doesn't use the term body mind all that often, although we should, and I'm hoping it will transition more. Some do, who are engaged in disability rights scholarship or disability studies. But the body mind is a really common term in the disability community because it pushes us to think about just absolutely through our language how deeply integrated the mind and body are. They're not two elements. They're not two different things. I mean, the gut is the second brain. The brain is embedded and, neurologically linked to every piece of our body, So really changing our language, how we talk about this can also help us change how we think about health and distress or dysregulation, because nothing is disconnected, So I really consciously use that term because it felt just really important for the book. And also, I'm trying to use it more and more in everything I do now.
Yeah, I really liked how that kind of combines everything into one piece. Behavioral psychology background also. So the whole nature versus nurture thing is very big in that community. And I'm like, does it really matter? There are things we can control and things we can't. And we just have to approach it as a whole thing for every single person that we come across. So it's a really cool concept to bring that into those spaces too.
Yeah,
I'd be really interested to see what behavioral psychologists do with that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many cans of worms we could open right now, but but I think that your point is really important, that there is nurture and there is nature, and in every single story, it's a little bit different. And it brings us back to the thresholds story, the thresholds theory, that whatever is burning beneath the surface is going to become inflamed by something. Maybe it's COVID, maybe it's that infection, maybe it's something else. But your story of actually I had a lot of friends in global health, people who I was poking around, and I found a lot of patients actually in the global health research community because they've lived around the world. I have one friend, friend who actually had a snake bite. She's had tuberculosis. She's had all this crazy stuff that's made her really ill, and no one knows how to care for her.
Oh gosh,
especially when you live across continents and you get all sorts of stuff that people just don't know what to do with, that become compounded. And these are extreme examples, but especially people living up, especially with Lyme, the contentiousness, which it does feel like is changing. Abby Dumas wrote this book, Divided Bodies, that I talk about in my book because I just think it's so brilliant, about how it's not just, the body is suffering in such deep ways, but the way people think about the suffering and about complex chronic illness versus acute, and what's real and what's unreal, are so divided and contentious. People literally get in fistfights about these things. And there are conventional, and then, in the Lyme community, there's conventional and Lyme literate, even guidelines about how to care for people. And when you know that these conditions are so explosive and divergent, that you're getting at something very, very emotive, but also real.
Yeah, it's incredible seeing how just even I was having a conversation today with a friend who is a very close friend, but who has not experienced the level of disabling chronic illness that I have, how difficult it is to have a conversation like that without experiencing over and over this feeling of that trauma bubbling up from having had conversations with people who don't believe you. And
Absolutely.
It's really important to me, and it's really important to me on this show in particular that everyone who comes on this show feels heard, understood, and most of all believed.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. I used to joke that one thing I need to write in every one of my protocols is hugging, because just feeling heard, especially when you're like an undocumented woman living in America and with a chronic illness, which has, was like a very early part of my research, just feeling listened to and heard can be so transformational. And, just that's why it's like so special to be able to do research or to be a therapist or to be, to do have a profession, or a social worker, to do a profession where you just really listen. And that's kind of your job, to really listen, because when in our lives do we just listen for 6 hours to someone share their story? You don't even do that necessarily with your friends, So it's just a special thing and really important. We need to do more listening.
Yeah. And I feel that every time I do a recording for this show, it's just so honored that somebody would share their story with me, of all people. I mean, who am I? I'm just this person who's dealt with chronic illness myself, and just decided, hey, I'll do a podcast about it, because why not? No, if nothing else, I'll get my story out there and maybe help a few more people understand what it's like going through these kinds of things. And then I get to talk to, professors at Georgetown University. It's amazing. So I'm so honored to have you here. One thing that I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned the term learned helplessness in the history on the ME/CFS diagnosis. How can we as patients advocate for ourselves as being quote unquote medically sick in the eyes of doctors if we feel that they are insisting that our symptoms are purely psychological in origin?
So let me just be very clear about that term and how I use it. I tell it as the history of oppression, as this kind of framework, as very harmful, and how it was a construction of explaining why some people didn't get well. And it was it was a very pejorative framework. And it was embedded and actually at the heart of this theory that came to be the GET CBT framework, right? That is very harmful, specifically for people who have post-exertional malaise exacerbation, right? So the learned helplessness frame, just putting it in there, I didn't anticipate actually incorporating that, but I was reading these papers, the early papers around the 1991 symposium about about chronic fatigue syndrome that I write about, because no one had really written about it, and I found it really interesting. I was in deep discussion with a colleague of mine, Arthur Kleinman, and he mentioned it, and I was like, oh, I got to read that. And I read it, and I was like, oh my God, what an interesting, influential conversation and symposium that influenced so many pieces. And I think one of the things that we don't think about when we think about power is how these conversations and these nodes and these social relationships can transform how whole medical systems envision and understand a condition.
Yeah.
It was really, really interesting. But I think this early frame ended up being really harmful and just kind of a trope that was accepted for a while. And it was kind of embedded in some early research papers and then kind of refuted and backed up. But there was just a time that was really harmful, and I think it still lives on. I mentioned this really explosive response in the Sick Times that had actually I did talk about this stuff as part of the history, but in a way that was talking about how problematic it was. But it's so sensitive. It is such a sensitive topic for patients because it was harmful, and so it devalued people and how people felt so deeply about this dismissal and how sick they were, right? It devalued how sick they were and how they were losing their social lives. And this lives on, and this kind of subjugation and dismissal of people's lived realities lives on. And I think that's why the sensitivity lives on. But I felt I needed to tell the story because the story comes comes from these powerful people trying to understand and representing the truth because patients were not knowledge partners. And I think that's really important to understand.
Oh, for sure. And it definitely tells, and I think the whole book really does tell just how powerful words can be, both in terms of harm and help, because words are how we're overcoming the words that have been so harmful for so long by telling our own stories and saying, hey, we're putting ourselves out there, we're being vulnerable, and in doing so, we are helping other people like us get the treatment that they deserve.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Something that I wanted to ask you on a personal level is, what would you say would be some good pathways to getting involved on like a local scale, but also like a national or even global scale in terms of trying to make changes in these communities?
I actually think the Patient-Led Research Collaborative is a really great organization to get involved with. And I think they're looking for more funding, but they have done some really pioneering work in understanding the problem. So if that's an interest, I think that's really incredible. Long COVID activism has been really organized and pretty expansive. So I think that's if people are interested just in general, like becoming part of the conversation, I think finding, there's so many groups on Facebook, on wherever, on social media. But these formal groups, like I think PLRC Research Collaborative, Patient-Led Research Collaborative, are really, really helpful in bringing people together. I think that engaging in dialogue about training and rethinking medical school. I think medical school needs to be reconsidered and reorganized in general. And I think really writing to the American Medical Association, I think also advocating to these professional groups that hold so much power, and also advocating against insurance companies that won't pay for people with complex chronic illnesses because they're not verifiable necessarily with a test, because their treatment odysseys are so complex because there aren't silver bullets to care for them. So taking up a cause, writing, educating people in the community, organizing, having tabling at community events can be so important, and can really make visible people's experiences. I know ME Action does a lot of different protests, or I was able to engage in one of their kind of protests at Georgetown, actually, where we set up a bunch, just kind of a whole stand, and it was really interesting to see people engage with it. I don't know. There's a lot. Right now, I think especially people in the disability community are just trying to survive, living with complex chronic illness with the changes to health insurance and jobs. In the DC area, which is different than a lot of places in the world, so many people are out of work, and it's just really hard. So I think people are just trying to get through this time, especially when they're also scared about ICE and other kind of like really unusual things that are happening.
That's why it's so important that we're telling our stories like this, like you are, and the people who are able to uplift the stories of others is so important. And I really hope this book gets people as fired up as I am about it, because I'm like, I need to go back to school. So yeah, it's amazing. I'm so happy that you've written this, that you've come here to talk to me. I'm so appreciative that you're here. And I just wanted to, before we wrap up, give you an opportunity to plug the book, your other books, your where we can find you on social media, or any appearances that you have coming up. So this will be published in the first Tuesday of February. So if you've got like any sort of upcoming events that you want to talk about too, just let the audience know where they can find you.
Okay. Yeah. I had a launch on Monday, and we'll put that on YouTube. It was an amazing conversation with 3 of my colleagues who I quote in the book, or talked to or interviewed. And then next Tuesday, I have a book launch at Politics and Prose, this like really awesome bookstore in DC. And they're actually going to put it on C-SPAN, which is so funny.
Wow.
I know. I'm like, whoa, really?
That's awesome.
So that's pretty cool. So I'll post those and share them with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I've got links for everything from your publicist. So we'll have that all in the show notes as well. And then I can post this stuff on social media as it comes out. So feel free to keep sending me links to things, because I'm sure the audience will want to follow along on your journey with this book. And thank you again. And please thank your publicist for reaching out to me. I'm so happy to have had you on the show.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been such a privilege to spend some time with you, and you're just doing such important work.
Thank you. And same to you. Thanks for listening to Abiding Hysteria, and thank you again to Emily Mendenhall for joining us this month. If this conversation has inspired you to tell your healthcare story, please reach out on social media at Abiding Hysteria or email me at abidinghysteria@gmail.com. If you'd like to support our efforts to tell these healthcare stories, become a patron today for only $5 a month at patreon.com/abidinghysteria. You'll get access to completely uncut episodes a week before the cut versions are released everywhere else, as well as bonus content and more. To find out when our next episode drops on Patreon, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever you listen to podcasts, follow us on social media. We're at Abiding Hysteria. Please be sure to rate, review, comment, and share so that others can find us as well. It really helps. I hope you have a lovely February. I will personally be celebrating my 40th birthday on the 27th, and I will see you all back here next month, or you can find me on Discord. There's a link to it in the show notes. Remember, when it comes to your healthcare, you deserve to be heard, understood, and most of all, believed.